Welcome to JSA TV and JSA Podcasts, the newsroom for telecom and data center professionals. I'm Jean-Marc Lima, and joining me today is Emma Fryer, partner at business consulting and services firm ERM, standing for Environmental Resources Management. Emma, thank you so much for talking to me. It's been a while since we've done an interview. First, how are you and what's this new role?
Right, so yes, after 10 years at Tech UK, sitting between the industry and the external world, which was a bit like between a rock and a hard place, I've moved to ERM. It's the world's largest pure play sustainability consultancy. So in a sense, I'm working with the same people on the same issues, but now I'm under the bonnet. So I've got a different perspective on it. But yeah, very much same kind of industry, same kind of thing. So I haven't left the industry at all. I'm still very much here.
Well, it would be a massive loss if you had left the industry. So I think a lot of people would be very happy around the globe to have you still here. Speaking about sustainability and the drivers, and focusing on Europe as well, what drivers are really driving the development of the sector in this old continent?
Okay, so I think you've got a number, it's a bit like a perfect storm. You've got really rapid growth, not just in the traditional markets and not just in obscure trading estates and industrial parks. You've got new sites being developed all over at scale, and we're starting to see them even in, there's some markets where we've always seen campus developments. The UK isn't really one of those, and we're starting to see bigger developments within communities now. They're becoming much more visible, these new developments. You've got this massive growth, and also you've got a clustering effect with this growth. So data centers, are, as we know, they have locational attributes, and they also are fairly demanding of resources we now consider scarce, like power and water. And when they cluster, that effect is magnified, and people really notice them. So we've got that growth on the one hand, and then we've got, I'd say, perhaps more external drivers to the sector, which are obviously things like policy, which is hugely impactful.
It's becoming very big.
Yeah, absolutely. The European policymakers data centers used to be captured by policy by accident, by regulation. So we had things like ID and EU ETS, which weren't really designed for the sector. Now data centers are absolutely in the crosshairs of the regulators, and they are called out in loads of regulation, and they're even developing data center specific policy instruments we're seeing. We've got a much better dialogue with them now, but that's hugely ambitious, and that's a massive driver for sort of new sustainability practices within the industry. Then we've got power provisioning. So the fact that we are struggling to find power in certain locations, I think that's going to, to some degree, force data centers to look elsewhere, but it will also accelerate the way that we're deploying alternative renewable energy sources. So I think that will accelerate that. I think we've got about an 8-year lag before some of the solutions are going to be ready, and that isn't going to solve current build needs, but that's it. And then there are two others that I think are really important. One is public perception, which is, as I said, they're starting to be visible within communities. And the last one is sort of partnerships and voluntary agreements. And what we've seen with the industry, you've seen the iMasons Climate Accord, which is looking at the embodied energy in data centers, which is absolutely spot on in terms of time, because as we decarbonize the operations, that embodied energy is going to be more important. And the European Commission, on a regulatory level, is pushing for that. They've got really intense scrutiny on that. So I think that is a really important one. And then you've got things like the Climate Neutral Data Center Pact, where they're doing a really good job in bringing up the minimum standards for the industry, and also they have transformed the policy dialogue with the Commission. So we have a much more enlightened and sort of cooperative policy dialogue. So I think those are the big drivers. They all begin with P, which is useful to remember them: policy, power, perception, and partnership.
The famous 4 or 5 Ps.
Yeah.
I was going to ask you maybe a bit of a housekeeping general question, but and I don't want to make this about Brexit. I think we've had a lot of coverage around Brexit, but where do UK operators have to look to nowadays for legislation? Do they look to Brussels or Downing Street?
They're still looking to Brussels, really. Okay. I think there will be. What worries me to some extent is that as you get divergence of legislation over time, they then just have to comply with both. So I must admit, I didn't in any way drop my attention off the Brussels policymaking machine for UK operators, because they are, and most of them have sites across Europe anyway. And that makes it frustrating, because they'll then find that they're dealing with one set of instruments in the UK and others in the rest of Europe. So I think
welcome to 21st century.
And even then, I mean, even within the European nation states, there's not as much consistency as you'd think in the way that these instruments are implemented. You know, you take something like EU ETS, it's actually a regulation, it's implemented differently. So it's not really for regulation a single entity. So I think we've now just got an additional layer of complexity.
Okay, but then from what you've seen, because we do see a lot more things coming now out of Brussels, out of the European Commission, European Union, and they do specifically mention data centers as well. From what you're seeing, are they taking the right path? Is it the right avenue, or you can see it becoming quite overwhelming and a bit too much that can hinder a bit of the development in the next 5-10 years?
I think the direction is right, because we've got some very, very big, environmental issues that we have to solve collectively. I worry a bit in terms of sometimes the implementation. So there's some very, very ambitious new instruments, or the recast of existing ones, where they're bringing in lots of things that companies must have a transformation plan, or they must do life cycle assessment of their supply chain, but they don't say how. And that could be hugely burdensome for small companies. It's hugely burdensome for big companies. So this is something the sector has got to get to grips with over the next few years, because 2030, by which time we're supposed to be climate neutral, is not that far away. Although what has happened is that there has been a discussion, because the Commissioner said, well, they hadn't defined what they meant by climate neutral by 2030. And that discussion is now being held between the sector and the Commission in a very productive way. So I think the direction is right, but I just think sometimes the way these things are implemented can be burdensome, specifically for smaller users, smaller providers.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I mean, we heard this week someone actually making the point that there's about just 30 quarters to go until 2030.
Yes, I heard that too.
So 30 quarters, yeah, because no one has it put it that way. It's usually like, oh, you've got 7-8 years, and 30 quarters will go like that. It's a blink of an eye to get there. So there's a lot of work to be done. But you also mentioned scrutiny, and I think that's very, very interesting, because this is starting to come up a lot more, especially around the public opinion. So people getting a little bit against data centers, and I guess maybe that comes down a little bit to the marketing done on the data center side to explain to populations what data centers actually do for them. What's your view on the public's perception and where this is all going? And of course, sustainability is probably the biggest pain point when it comes to public perception around data centers.
I think it's it's certainly front of mind for operators. Certainly at the shows I've been at this week, it came up in every single session I either attended or was on. So public perception's incredibly important. And I think the sector doesn't always help itself by being quite secretive. There's a kind of nothing to see here, nothing to see here. And there's a massive, great development going on here, and people want to know what it is. And as I said, as they get, with this clustering effect particularly, you can understand then why people are thinking, well, are there going to be jobs for me? Are people just going to come in with fancy cars and push house prices up? Local authorities are going to worry about longer term things. For instance, if you end up with a very homogeneous set of businesses and employers in an area, they want a variety of employers in an area. And so if you get a very heavy clustering effect, they might not like that. So there's all these sorts of long-term things and short-term things. And I do think that what we're seeing in the sector is a complete change of mindset in how they do this. So previously it was just something you kind of did to get your site through planning, and now we're seeing really good practice in the sector. I only know this because I'm a judge on a couple of awards which are about social engagement, community engagement, and I see these fantastic case studies coming in. What's interesting though, and a lot of companies are doing really good stuff after. So it's, they're now doing very high quality, properly engaged activities with their communities and sort of along community development in terms of creating jobs, upskilling, retraining, all sorts of things. And again, we're not really hearing about those enough. I think we're not sharing that best practice. And the other thing that I have noticed, and this is only anecdotally, is that operators I've spoken to seem to have those two things as separate processes. So the pre-build, there's one team that does community engagement, and those are now doing, a really good job. And then post-build, there's a different team. And I haven't seen that much evidence of it being a seamless process. That might just because I haven't, engaged enough. But it's about joining that thing up, I think. And I think, I would have said a few years ago that really all the best practice was in other sectors on this, sectors we don't really associate ourselves with, like mining and oil and gas and chemicals. But actually we are seeing experience. Yeah, because they've had 30 years of experience with this. But actually we're seeing good practice in this sector now. We just need to learn from each other and share it, I think.
Okay. Well, what's been like a good example that you've seen? You don't need to mention names, but we hear a lot about, of course, the heat exchanges going to the communities, heating pipelines. We've heard about bees. We've heard about raising fish, greenhouses, sunflowers. What's been like something that has really like, oh, this is a really good idea?
I think it's when it's qualitative. So I've seen some where you actually speak to people there, find out what they need, what are their educational and employment goals, and then you help them meet that. You either fund programs, or you do outreach, or you do, I'm not sure what you do, you take in people, or so I think those ones where, and there are quite a few of those now, where that it's entirely informed and co-led by the communities. It's not just about, yes, it's not just about merch. Of course, it's not. It's about engaging with those communities to find out what they need, what would make their lives better. And some talk about a community dividend, and I think that's a really good term. It's not just about, share dividends. There should be a community dividend as well. So I think those that are looking at that community dividend are the really good examples.
Yeah, I mean, well, the gentrification data center, the gentrification of the data center cannot overshadow the human capital, especially the community human capital, which is very important. But I think the other aspect as well that we've seen changing a lot in the last few years, and I guess even more over COVID with the booming construction that we had, is around investment, because the word on the street is if you're not green, or if you don't have a green plan, you get no cash at all now. And with cash becoming more expensive, that's even more, it makes things even harder. So what's your take on the investment front?
So I that's a really interesting question, because for years we've seen customers driving sustainability practices. We want you to buy green power, we want this, we want. So you see that in procurement. And I think investors have been later to that. And now they've kind of overtaken, and they're being really, really demanding. But if you look at the new instruments coming in, the taxonomy, TCFD, coming CSRD, then those have real teeth, and it will be impossible, I think, to get investment if you can't perform well against the criteria.
I think you just gave us a podcast name, The Real Tea of Data Centers. I think that'll be an amazing podcast. And then, I mean, I'm almost jumping from topic to topic, because there's so much to talk about this. If we don't do it this way, we can talk for days.
We can talk faster.
Yeah, I already talked too fast. No one understands me. So, but no, I was going to ask you about the power provisioning, because unfortunately we are not in the best situation right now, especially in Europe. I was going to ask you, what do you expect? And I know it's a hard question, because no one really knows. If we knew, we wouldn't probably go into it. But what you can expect that's going to happen over this winter in the European continent, and maybe a little bit beyond that, in terms of data center developments and power issues?
I don't know about for data center developments. I don't know, and I don't know enough about the sort of commodity situations of whether we're really going to struggle this winter. Where I think the issues are with a lot of the power provision, particularly in the UK, and I spent years sort of banging on the door of National Grid saying, can we talk about data centers? And they would come back and say, well, why do you need to talk about data centers? They're all in Ireland. Well, actually, they're not. Well, and the sector's growing fast, and we need to talk to you about capacity. And the problem is the grid is so heavily regulated, they cannot speculatively add capacity. They have to respond. And I think that is one problem, just freeing up some of that, a more speculative approach to power provisioning by the providers. But also it's very inflexible in the sense that it's created a tragedy of the commons. Everyone then tries to buy as much power as they possibly could ever use ever. So power provisioning is all about the maximum amount you might ever use. And then once you've captured that power, there's no opportunity to, and I don't know what the phrase is, I remember talking about this earlier this week, but to sort of sublet that while you're not using it, which would actually then take a lot of strain off. And we can't, so it's about, fundamentally, it's about having a strategic conversation between the users and providers, and that hasn't happened yet, certainly not in the UK. And that was really about as far as my bailiwick went in terms of power provisioning. And obviously it is forcing, and it will drive an accelerated uptake in renewables, but there's only so much you can do as these, to get these things. Most of these technologies are still piloting, and that they're not going to be deployed in a critical environment until people are really sure. And we think that's about 8 years for many of them.
Okay, so in an 80 period. My question would be then, are you worried over the next few months?
I'm not, but I'm not running a data center.
Okay. So people that run data centers should be worried.
No, I honestly don't know. I mean, I think we do incredibly well in terms of power security and backup. What we would be concerned about, I suspect, is, and I'm only speculating here, is sort of second order risks. So what happens? We need to operators need to come off load, or come off grid because there isn't enough power to go around. They have to run on diesel. How do we know they're going to be able to resupply that? How long will they have to do that? What will be the air quality impacts? And I know there has been a conversation with the Environment Agency, because if they're obliged to run because there isn't enough power, there will have to be some very hard work done to make sure that sensitive receptors aren't affected by additional running. So there's it's non-trivial on every level, and no one wants to run their data center on diesel.
No,
really don't.
It's even in your days, it was not something we really wanted to do, and especially now. But hopefully, this will all drive the adoption of sustainable frameworks a lot faster as well, come the spring, because a lot of governments are deploying so much renewable energy systems now, especially in Southern Europe. So hopefully, that will all push us into a better place after this period.
I think so. I mean, I think the problem with that is that you've got to then get that. It's about the capacity in the network to get it where you need it. So that's going to be, I think, the biggest challenge.
That's another one. Yeah. Well, we've seen France blocking that a little bit, but let's not get political.
No,
but we have seen, even in times of crisis, some countries have blocked some of those developments to bring energy to where it's needed.
Wow.
Because of long-term objectives. So because Portugal and Spain got very affected by something like that, and they're now looking to Italy to maybe get a pipeline through Italy as opposed to go through France.
Wow.
So I mean, it's bad periods, they always also bring these things up.
They focus the mind. They focus the mind, don't they? Yeah.
But I was going to ask you, because I mean, you're one of the brightest minds in this sector around this topic. I was going to ask you, what did I not ask you that you think it's important right now?
Oh, I think you've been very comprehensive. I think certainly at the moment I'm most interested in this public perception, because that is, if we get that wrong and battle lines get drawn up, then it's, it all becomes ideological. It stops being a proper conversation. So actually, although we've already talked about it, that's certainly my front of mind, and how we do that right.
Okay, that's interesting. So the industry is definitely shifting towards another thematic, which is very interesting. And then Emma, to conclude, I was going to ask you, where can people find more information about ERM? How can people reach out?
Brilliant. Okay, so there's a ERM website, erm.com. That's quite an easy one.
Simple, easy.
And obviously, I'm on LinkedIn, so by all means, drop me a note on LinkedIn, and love to get in touch.
Okay, cool. And I'm sure you always have loads of messages, so bear in mind with your reply. But Emma, thank you so much for talking to me. It's been a pleasure. It's been so long as well, so it's really been a pleasure talking to you, and hope we see you soon in the flesh. As for your home, thank you so much for watching and for tuning into JSA TV and JSA Podcasts. And don't forget to check our social channels for more content. Until next time, happy networking.